Ladies and gentlemen, Bessie Goldstick will now introduce a gentleman who doesn't need a lot of introduction, but Bessie's going to do an excellent job of adding to the team.
Today, we have an incredible young man, I'm going to call him an incredible young man, who's done a lot, spent his whole life in the music film industry here in Edmonton. And the most important thing recently is that he started the Tommy Banks Performing Artists Fund at the Edmonton Community Foundation. And it's my honor and privilege to introduce Tommy Banks.
Thank you, Bessie. Well, I've been following Bessie around for years. And always with great pleasure. I even followed her to the table today. And even greater pleasure because Bessie's wonderful from the front, but from the back, she's really terrific. The subject area that has been suggested that I talk to you about today is politics. Or has to do with politics, at least. Politics is a word that derives from poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning small, blood-sucking creatures. In order to be a good politician, Mr. Churchill said that you had to have the ability to forecast precisely what will happen, and more importantly, the ability to explain why it did not. This year, 2012, we marked the 145th anniversary of Confederation. Excuse me, and we also marked the 144th anniversary of the first discussion on Senate reform. Now I have to speak to you very honestly today because I hope that you will join me in recognizing the presence here of a number of distinguished people, the most distinguished of whom, if I can have the merit to say that, has served us well in the House of Commons for many years and subsequently in the Senate for many years, the Honorable Doug Roche. Doug will keep me straight. I've never liked the term reform because when I was young, the only context in which I understood that word was reform school, which had to do with the correction of criminal behavior. That isn't to say that there hasn't been criminal behavior in the Senate. There has, although not at a rate equal to the considerably larger rate in the House of Commons, and at a rate considerably less than that of the general population. Large swaths of whom will soon find themselves in prison for inexplicable terms due to the removal of judicial discretion from our criminal courts. But that's a discussion for another time. It's a discussion that I hope we will have for another time. Speaking of reform, my view is that it is Parliament in its entirety that is in need of reform. And that the Senate, while it needs to be changed, is much less in need of reform than the other place, as we call it. Because Parliament, writ large, but Parliament is not doing its job, and it hasn't been doing it for a long time, due to the inexorable sliding of power over the past 4 decades or so, from Parliament into the office of the Prime Minister, both Prime Ministers, both stripes, both parties, all three parties. This is not so much the fault of successive progressive conservative, liberal, and conservative prime ministers of all colors. It's the fault of the individuals who sit in Parliament, mainly, in my view, in the House of Commons, who have collectively forgot the fundamentals of the Constitution and the proper role of the House of Commons in the scheme of things. They have forgot that the government, the ministers of the Crown, are in our system a function of Parliament, and not the other way around. British prime ministers wake up every morning with a very healthy fear of their own MPs. And US presidents pay very careful attention to their party's Congress members. But Canadian prime ministers, progressive conservative, liberal, and conservative, have become more and more likely to treat their caucus members with disdain, or even worse, with indifference. They're able to ignore the constitutional fact that they derive their power from the House of Commons. Both the Commons, and to a slightly lesser degree the Senate, have either forgotten how to use their collective authority or have lost the will to wield it. But on the subject of the Senate, the title of my little dissertation today is The Senate You Thought You Knew, which is the title of a book by the Honorable Serge Joyal, one of the most distinguished members of that institution, and I hope that he will be pleased by my plagiarizing of his title. The Senate is the least misunderstood institution in Canada, with the possible exception of the CFL. Some basic facts that need to be made clear, which I hope will engender some good discussion among you and perhaps questions afterwards. You are expected, I know you are better informed than most Canadians. However, most of us don't know, and I didn't know before my first encounter with the Senate, that if you look at the constitutional debates beginning in 1874, more time, more attention, more concern, more words were written down, more speeches were made on the question of the Senate and what its nature will be within our Confederation than on any other subject. The existence of the Senate became a condition precedent to Confederation for the simple reason that there needed to be protection against the tyranny of the majority. Red by pop is a wonderful thing. But the smaller provinces in Confederation recognized that if there was only going to be red by pop, that Ontario would simply decide what's going to happen in Canada, and that would be the end of it. That's why we have a bicameral parliament. The powers of both houses of parliament are, in almost every respect, equal. The Senate has an outright veto on legislation, which it uses rarely, much more rarely than I believe it should, and very carefully. The rules of the Senate under which it operates are utterly different from those of the House of Commons. A couple of tiny examples are, for example, the Senate of Canada takes attendance every day and publishes it the next morning. No other legislature in Canada does that. You don't know whether you're MLA, unless there was a vote that's in the legislature today. You don't know whether you're MP in Parliament today. And you can be short one. Because attendance is not taken in any other legislative body in Canada. In the Senate, you can find out tomorrow morning who was there today. The Senate can overrule its speaker, which the House of Commons cannot, and has and does, and both Doug and I were there. That happened. The attitude there is utterly different from the one in the House of Commons, because we both have whips. But the whip in the Senate is virtually powerless, because, to put it very simply, once appointed, you can't get rid of me. I don't need your leader to sign my nomination papers. I don't need the right colored bond signs in the next election. And I have no upward mobility aspirations in respect of running a cabinet. So, whip away. My first experience with the Senate came long, decades before I had the privilege of being called. I was involved in lobbying in the House of Commons against a piece of legislation which was being proposed by a government which then had a large majority in the House of Commons and an even larger majority, an overwhelming majority in the Senate. It was a bad piece of legislation, and everyone who was going to be affected by it knew that it was a bad piece of legislation, and we lobbied hard in the House of Commons. But the government, the ministers of the Crown, not the individual members of the House of Commons, but the ministers of the Crown, the Prime Minister, was determined that it should pass, notwithstanding its weaknesses. And the House of Commons passed the bill. The Senate, and we began to lobby the Senate, which had a majority, an overwhelming majority of the same party. The senators listened. And on the day that that vote came in the Senate, which was the first time I was ever in that building, the government majority in the Senate defeated the government bill. And on that day, my appreciation of what the Senate does, or can do, went up several notches. Now, the Senate about which I'm going to talk to you today is an idealized Senate. It is the Senate at its best. The Senate is sometimes, and has been in the past sometimes, at its worst, not at its best. If you were to imagine a horizontal timeline which represented a median of Senate independent action. I can't say non-partisan, because it's never quite non-partisan, but non-electorally partisan action by the Senate. It would be a wavy line over the years. Sometimes the Senate is very activist and very independent, flexing its muscles, and other times it doesn't. But to talk about the Senate at its best, if I were to simply stand here and attempt to defend or aggrandize the Senate, that would be suspect on its face, because I said yes when I was asked if I would sit there, and I accepted the Queen's commission and her money, your money. Instead, I'm going to bore you by telling you what others, not senators, have said from time to time about the Senate. Sometimes very nice things are said. But it's rather like the birth of good news. When somebody is accused of something, it's on page 1. When they are found to have been utterly innocent of it, it's at the bottom of the column on page 38. Good news and compliments are sort of boring, so we pay less attention to them than we do to reports of disasters or criticism. But here are some things which I will read to you that others have said in the press in the past few years about the Senate. First, about matters in the Senate with which I had no direct connection beyond voting. For the National Post, while the House of Commons has served as little more than a rubber stamp, with even its committees overcome by partisan loyalties, the Senate has contributed significantly to the policy-making process. In addition to Michael Kirby's healthcare report and his mental health care report, a more useful and intelligent document of the Ode to Medicare produced by Roy Romano, Senate committees have advanced debate on drug laws, defense spending, and bank mergers with thoughtful, well-researched studies. Whereas Senate committees are given free rein to address the major issues facing the country, such opportunities are rarely granted to their Commons counterparts. Clearly, these constraints must be lifted if the Commons is to contribute to policy debates in the same way as the Senate. But it's also incumbent upon individual MPs to follow the upper chamber's example. From the Ottawa Citizen, the Senate committee has delivered another impressive tome. It sheds more illusions and we hope will stir Canadians from their ideological slumber about public health care. Point, though, is the Senate committee has not hesitated to tread where other politicians fear to go. Bandaging our current system with money alone will not stem the hemorrhaging. I parenthetically point out that the Romano Royal Commission on Health Care cost about $15 million. I have no disrespect to that commission's report, but it is sadly the case that it is no longer referred to in any substantive way. The Kirby report, which has become a sort of template for healthcare policy, cost about $400,000. From the Montreal Gazette, the difference between the two committees is substantial. The House of Commons Finance Committee is where people go to make speeches about bank service charges and unseemly profits. The Senate Banking Committee is where they go for a discussion of serious issues. From the Farmers Independent Weekly, a review of recent transcripts of the Senate Standing Committee on Agriculture and Forestry illustrates that whatever their past political affiliations, senators have parked them at the meeting room door. Reading discussions at the Senate committee are a breath of fresh air, Members of the committee seem to be able to frame the problems more directly than MPs. For the Vancouver Sun, too often they see a thing that is obviously wrong, yet politicians aren't willing to fix it. Such is the case with the so-called lost Canadians, who were wrongly stripped of citizenship between 1947 and 1977 because of bungled legislation. The only people in Ottawa who seem to really understand the unfairness of the government's position are the senators. They voted unanimously in May to restore the citizenship to children who have been wrongly stripped of it. Mary Janigan, writing in Maclean's magazine, said somehow, as the output of the Commons has waned, the Senate has shone. Committees are tackling hot topics ranging from bank mergers to health care to legalization of marijuana. The senators have the freedom and perspective, and they're doing one heck of a job. In a chamber where appointment has been called taskless thanks, evidence of this unexpected revival is everywhere. The Senate has become the unlikely but very real watchdog for Canadian interests in Ottawa. In the Calgary Herald, the Senate's research role is effective because, unlike the House of Commons, it enjoys the luxury of time and usually avoids the mindless partisanship that so disfigures debates in the lower house. The Senate hires good researchers, expert witnesses are called, and sensible recommendations usually result. From the Sunday Herald in Halifax, democracy in Canada is clearly in a state of constitutional crisis. Two federal legislative bodies, the House of Commons and the Senate, were historically tasked with the responsibility of governing the country's affairs. But one of these bodies today seems both democratically dated and increasingly irrelevant. Serious work certainly goes on in one chamber. Its committees tackle important issues and produce timely, cogent reports. Its members, while speaking up for their regions, also seem receptive to listening to the views of Canadians on important issues of the day. Meanwhile, its counterpart merely spins its wheels almost daily. Many members are often absent. What's worse, though, is that the majority also ignores their constituents' interests when supporting or opposing legislation, instead voting strictly along the well-enforced party lines. The solution, though radical, seems unavoidable. We must abolish the House of Commons. We wish, the editor said, that we could be more facetious in saying that. But based on performance in recent years, it's the much maligned, unelected Canadian Senate that has done much of the serious work of addressing complex topics. The result has been that the upper chamber's deliberations have been more substantive and of higher quality than what usually emanates from the House of Commons. Good value? You decide. Now, speaking of value, I haven't got the most recent numbers for costs because they haven't been pulled out yet, but in 2007, the operating cost of the Senate was $2.41 per Canadian. He once did a survey to find out what the Canadians thought the average cost of the capital of operating the Senate was, and it ranged anywhere from $50 to $2. It's actually $2.41. I think it's close to $2.50 now. The cost of the House of Commons was $11.34 per Canadian. The Commons is about 3 times bigger than the Senate, but it costs about 5 times more than that to operate. And if you throw in the cost of the Prime Minister's office, the number goes up much further. The average cost, by the way, of provincial legislatures per capita in Canada is $18. Here's a bit from Paul Wells, writing in the National Post. Yesterday, I chatted with a fellow who spends a lot of time testifying before parliamentary committees. He said it's not the Commons committees that make him do all the work, it's the Senate committees. Senators are less prone to spout the party line. They're not only more familiar with proposed legislation, they've read more widely in a given field. The questions are more surprising. MPs could capture the same freewheeling spirit. They simply need to decide it's worth their while. And this is an article by Jim Happer, who's the author of Canadian Criminology, Strategies and Perspectives, writing in the Times column. Recently, I testified before a Senate Committee on Legal and Constitutional Affairs on the proposed Youth Justice Criminal Act. Earlier, I had appeared before the Comparable Committee in the House of Commons. I also observed the testimony of other witnesses. Both committees asked good questions, but there were noticeable differences. About twice as many senators attended as MPs. The senators asked questions that were more profound. They had read the briefs more carefully as well and the proposed legislation. The senators were constantly digging information out of the witnesses. Both the MPs and the senators were aware of weaknesses in the proposed act. The MPs were concerned about the impact on voters. The senators were concerned about the impact on the kids. And now a couple of comments about Senate business with which I did have a direct connection. In the meantime, said the Winnipeg Free Press, while we disagree with the Senate committee's call to bring home the troops, we applaud its boldness in arguing that this is where our current neglect of defense may lead. Senate committees of late have shown vision and courage. In the battle of ideas, the Senate leads the way. And speaking on the CBC, Michael Enright said, "Who could ever have imagined that the Senate, the red chamber of sober second and soporific thought, after much careful deliberation, would come crashing into the 21st century with a blindingly good idea? They have done what the House of Commons has never had the guts to do, put the issue of marijuana use on the public agenda for debate and argument." From the National Post, 3 cheers for unelected senators. Last week they released a report stating that Canada's marijuana laws were enormous resources, wasted enormous resources, destroyed the lives of drug users, infringe on civil liberties, foster organized crime, and do absolutely nothing to stop people from getting high. Recognizing this simple, crushingly obvious truth, the Senate has produced a rare government document that speaks in the voice of moral sanity. From the Ottawa Sun, the recent Senate report on Canadian security and military preparedness will be ignored by the real power holders in Ottawa, mostly because it is so thoroughly devastating in highlighting the negligence in sustaining this country's most important social program, domestic security. The report by the Standing Committee on National Security and Defense is a stunner. From Barbara Jaffe, writing in the Vancouver Sun, a just released Senate report on Canadian security and military preparedness is an absolute mind-boggler. 15 senators spent 7 months hearing testimony, traveling to the U.S., scrutinizing what's out there across Canada, and brought back an absolute horror story. It's noteworthy that it took a Senate committee to reveal this stuff. From the Toronto Sun, as amazing as it may seem, there were a few Canadians worried about our national security, our stressed out military, and our vulnerability to terrorists before 9/11. Even more amazing, they were members of the Senate. When the unthinkable happened that morning, Senator Kennedy and his small band of sober second thinkers, officially the Standing Senate Committee on National Security and Defense, had already begun examining our shocking security loopholes for almost 4 months, questioning the almost total lack of government oversight of Canada's dozen or so intelligence surveys, and so on. There are many, many more. I won't bore you with the rest of them. But you get the point that others than I, who pay attention to these questions, have sometimes high regard for the things that the Senate does and has done, and one hopes someday will do. In the meantime, I ask you to remember, please, that I was talking about the Senate at its best. There have from time to time been instances of the Senate at its worst. Like all ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your very kind, I almost say that expression, and I hope that we have any time for this. I hope that there will be argument and questions, and most importantly, I hope that you will take away the following question. If we are going to change the Senate, or if you like, when we want to change the Senate, we must be sure that we change it in a way so that when we tear down this house, we put a better one in its place and think about the implications of that. And in order to do that, it would help if you were to examine a report from about 8 years ago by the Fraser Institute, which is a conservative think tank. The conclusion of it was called Senate Reform. And its conclusion was, wait a minute, be careful what you ask for. Think about what you replace this with and change. Think about the ways in which we change it, what that would mean for governance of our country. Thank you very much.
1-minute comment from the ex-senator on the notion of an elected, equal, and effective Senate.
You hear the question? Triple E. Well, we can forget about equal, because that is, if you look in the dictionary beside the word impossible, there's an explanation of Senate equality, provincial equality in Canada. We have, and most of us forget this, we have regional equality. The Senate was devised in those constitutional debates to which I referred earlier, whereas the United States decided that Rhode Island would have the same number of senators as California. Canada decided that it would not be equal on a provincial basis, but rather on a regional basis, and therefore the Senate contained, before things got messed up a bit, 24 senators from Ontario, 24 senators from Quebec, 24 senators from the Maritime, 24 senators from the Western Province. The argument about changing Senate representation on the basis of population goes against the entire purpose of a bicameral parliament. A couple of countries have tried. There are a couple of countries in the world that are quite significant. There are unitary states that have unicameral parliaments. But those that have tried, Germany after the Second World War, for example, have found that it doesn't work very well. They had to redo their constitution and reintroduce an upper house. If Canada were to be, so we can forget about equality on a provincial basis, because if you believe that Prince Edward Island will agree to have the same number of senators as Quebec, or that British Columbia will agree to have the same number of senators as Prince Edward Island, which would be required under a constitutional change to meet that kind of equality, it's virtually impossible. So that takes care of equal. Effective, I argue that the Senate can be effective and is effective just about as often as most legislative bodies. There are stasis from time to time. There are impediments to action and forward motion from time to time in any legislative body of any size, whether it's in any order of government, municipal, provincial, or federal. I argue that the Senate, if it is operated properly and when it runs properly and when its members recognize what they do, is as effective as any legislative body in the country. Can it be made more effective? Yes, and it should be made more effective. It should use its powers more frequently than it does. And it should become less electorally partisan than it sometimes is. Elected. Well, there are great arguments on both sides of that question. The Senate was devised, if you read again those constitutional debates, specifically to be a not political place. And even today, there are about 100 senators, there are 105 senators. On average, over the past 70 or 80 years, you'd find that about 30 of them, I think you'll find the number, were previously politicians, municipal, provincial, or federal, before they came to the Senate. But about 70 were not. I think I got the number about right, Doug. About 70, they were farmers, bankers, teachers, labor leaders, piano players, hockey players. And that's why in the Senate, we got to ask the stupid questions, which is, wait a minute, why are we doing this? Or didn't we try this once before and didn't we find out that it wasn't a good idea? Or those kinds of questions, because most of us in the Senate, and this is even true today, we're not politicians before we got there. So when we elect senators, assuming that they were planning on voting, we'll have 105 more politicians. We will have got elected. If we elect them, we must make sure that they can't stand for re-election at the end of their term, however long it is, because if they were susceptible of re-election, reappointment, then whatever semblance of independence exists in the Senate will disappear. So if we want to elect a Senate, we must recognize that it will become A, absolutely political, and B, by far the more powerful of the two parties. Parliament. Without that, just ask yourself which House of Congress is the more powerful in the United States. The answer is the Senate, without any question. That would be true here. Let me give you an example of what. Let's say you're a lobbyist trying to stop a piece of legislation, and you've got $100,000 to spend, or $1 million to spend, and you've got 6 months to do it. Either House of Parliament can stop that legislation. It's true now. You can spend that money on 105 senators, or on 318 members of the House of Congress, each of whom represent a relatively small efficiency, whereas each senator represents the entire province. Either of those places can be convinced by your spending your money and time to do your ethic. Where are you going to spend your money and time? The same place to spend in the United States. So if we want to have the upper house of Parliament, by far the more powerful of the two houses of Parliament, you should elect them. That's my short answer.
Thank you very much, Tommy, and I have to thank Dave Yardley for asking the most time-consuming question we've had. Well, one of the best questions. That was really a good question, so thank you, Dave, and thank you, Tommy.
It was the answer that was time-consuming.
No, no, it was very, very informative. I'd like to then ask Mr. Wigan, one of our directors, to thank our speakers.
Senators, my privilege today to bring the gratitude of the room to you. Thanks. This is, after all, and you are an imminent gathering where we come together to hear thoughtful and intelligent comment on issues facing Canada, our province, and our city. I think you have set a new bar, certainly for speakers and members that are considered amongst the most eminent. Thank you for your efforts today. As always, a donation of $200 will be sent to the charity from Mass Choice. Thank you very much.
I'm sure you might use it.
I usually have a drink in my hand. Good, again. What's the guessing on? Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Tommy had a birthday a couple of days ago, and he looks pretty good for a guy who's 22, doesn't he? Lots of life in him. He should have raised that Saturday. Our wishes go out to Don Milne, who's in the Royal Alexander Hospital. Best wishes for Don in terms of his speedy recovery. I'd like to also ask Yusuf if he would stand, please, and we should give a round of applause for our treasurer, who's retiring as of December the 31st. December is the club's membership renewal month, and Jordan McDougall is vice president in charge of the membership. But I'd like a round of applause for him and all the members of the team who worked so hard in bringing around our new and put in place our new membership process. So please stand if you will, so we can mark it stand. Oh well, let's give them applause. The board of directors has been trying to find a better way of keeping in touch with the membership and confirming the number of club members that are attending our luncheons. We've used a mix of emails and telephone messages, and we're trying and experimenting and trying to do a better job. But we'd certainly appreciate any feedback or suggestions from you as to how we're doing, and if you think there's ways we could do a better job in those areas. Your president and his good wife, Margaret, will be in Maui for the month of January. And the club, the direction and the board will be in the capable hands of our past president, Bob Crawford. So while I'll be thinking of you, will not be here at the next election meeting in January. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Queen is
God save our gracious Queen, God save our noble Queen, God save our Queen. Stand her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us, God save our Queen.
declare the meeting adjourned at 1:25.